The entity is called the Presence, and if you have never heard that name before, that is exactly the problem. In the DC universe, the home of Superman, Batman, and the Justice League, the Presence is not a character, it is not a villain, it is not even a god in any way you would recognize. The Presence is the source, the origin point, the single, unflinching, all-knowing authority from which all of DC existence was born. It created everything, it sustains everything, and now, for reasons no being in either universe can fully explain, it has turned its attention toward Marvel. The first being to truly understand what was happening was not a hero, it was not a god, it was the Watcher, Uatu, the ancient cosmic observer who has spent millennia documenting every event in the Marvel universe from his silent post on the moon. Uatu has seen civilizations rise and fall. He has watched universes crack and reform. He has witnessed horrors that would shatter mortal minds into dust. But when the Presence arrived, something changed in him. Something that Watchers are never, ever supposed to feel. For the first time in his eternal existence, Uatu was afraid, not of destruction, of evaluation. Here is what made that fear so devastating. The Presence did not attack, it did not challenge, it did not flex cosmic power in some grotesque display of dominance meant to crush lesser beings into submission. It simply looked. And in that looking, in that single, patient, infinite act of observation, Uatu realized something that would define the entire course of what followed. The Presence was not here to conquer the Marvel universe, it was not here to destroy it. It was here to inspect it, to examine it, to hold it up to a standard that no universe in existence had ever been asked to meet before. A standard called perfection. And that is where the real horror begins. Because the Marvel universe was never built to be perfect. It was built to struggle. It was designed, if designed is even the right word, around chaos, around failure, around heroes who lose more than they win, gods who contradict each other, timelines that collapse and rebuild in endless loops of suffering and rebirth. Marvel does not work because of order. Marvel works because of beautiful, violent, heartbreaking disorder. And the Presence does not tolerate disorder, not even a little, not even if that disorder is what gives a universe its soul. That is the collision about to happen, and no one could stop it. Think about what that means for a moment. Really let it sit. Every hero you have ever loved in the Marvel universe, every sacrifice, every impossible victory, every moment where someone refused to give up against all odds, none of it was built on a foundation that the Presence would consider acceptable. The Avengers did not become heroes because of divine will. They became heroes because the universe was broken, and they chose to fight anyway. Spider-Man did not gain his powers through cosmic design. He gained them through tragedy and chose mercy in response. And now, an authority beyond comprehension was here to decide whether that kind of heroism was enough. Uatu recorded everything he could, every sensation, every subtle shift in the fabric of reality as the Presence settled into its evaluation. And in his ancient, meticulous logs, documents that no mortal would ever read, he wrote a single entry that captured the entire weight of what was about to unfold. He wrote, "This Presence does not observe. It does not judge with anger. It does not judge with cruelty. It judges with silence. And silence in this context is the most terrifying thing of all." The Presence had arrived, the inspection had begun, and somewhere in the vast, chaotic, beautiful wreckage of the Marvel universe, something was about to be found wanting. To understand why the Presence arriving in the Marvel universe is not a battle, it is an extinction-level collision of philosophy. You first need to understand what the Presence actually is, and that is harder than it sounds. Because in the DC universe, the Presence is not described the way gods are typically described. It is not a being with motivations, desires, or a personality you can negotiate with. It does not sit on a golden throne. It does not speak in riddles or make bargains with desperate mortals. The Presence simply is. It is the origin, the root, the single, unshakable point from which all of DC reality was born and continues to exist without question. Think of it this way. In DC, when beings trace the line of existence back to its very first moment, when they follow the thread of creation all the way to the beginning, every single path leads to one place, one source. The Presence did not create the DC universe the way an architect designs a building. It did not plan it, sketch blueprints, or argue over details. The Presence is creation itself. It is the act of existence made conscious. Gods like Zeus, beings like the Anti-Monitor, even ancient terrors like Darkseid, all of them are Tao Te's. End stream. All of them exist because the Presence permitted it. There is no negotiation, there is no appeal, there is only the source and everything that flows from it. And here is the critical detail that makes the Presence fundamentally different from anything Marvel has ever encountered. The Presence does not rule through power, it does not conquer through force. It does not need to fight, because fighting implies that opposition is possible. Opposition is not possible against the Presence. It is not a king on a throne that can be challenged. It is the throne itself. It is the ground the throne sits on. It is the very concept of authority made real and infinite. When the Presence makes a decision about reality, that decision is not enforced. It simply becomes the new truth. No resistance, no workaround. Only what the Presence has decided, and what exists because of it. Now, before we go any further, before we descend into what happens when absolute divine judgment collides with a universe built on chaos, rebellion, and endless war, I need you to do something. If this kind of story is what keeps you up at night, cosmic dread, philosophical horror, two universes colliding under impossible weight, then hit subscribe, hit that bell. Because what is about to unfold over the next 30 minutes is not a fight, it is a verdict, and trust me, you are going to want to be here when the sentence is read. Comment below right now. Would you want your universe judged? Now, turn your attention to Marvel and notice immediately how different it feels. Because the Marvel universe was never built around a single supreme authority. It was built around fragmentation, around contradiction, around a dozen cosmic gods arguing across infinite dimensions, while the universe burned and rebuilt itself around their disagreements. Marvel has eternity, the living embodiment of the universe itself. It has the living tribunal, a cosmic judge meant to maintain balance. It has the one above all, a figure so shrouded in mystery that even Marvel's own writers have contradicted each other about what it truly is. Marvel's cosmology is not a pyramid, it is a storm, a beautiful, chaotic, endlessly self-contradicting storm of power that has survived for millennia inside that chaos. Marvel's universe does not simply exist, it cycles, it destroys itself and rebuilds, over and over and over again. The Infinity Wars, the Secret Wars, Ragnarok after Ragnarok, timelines that shatter, reset, fold back on themselves, and emerge slightly different, slightly more broken, slightly more desperate than before. This is not a flaw in Marvel's design. This is the design. The Marvel Universe survives because it is never allowed to settle, never allowed to become static, never allowed to reach a state of perfect, permanent equilibrium. Because in Marvel's logic, equilibrium is death, stagnation is extinction. The universe keeps moving, keeps bleeding and healing and bleeding, exhaustes, and that relentless, painful motion is what keeps it breathing. That is the engine, that is the heartbeat. And the heroes are the purest expression of that engine. Spider-Man did not become a hero because destiny commanded it. He became one because tragedy struck, and he chose compassion over revenge. Captain America did not rise because of divine appointment. He rose because the world needed someone stubborn enough to refuse surrender. The Avengers did not form because a cosmic plan dictated their existence. They formed because a handful of broken, deeply flawed individuals looked at a universe in crisis and said, "We will fight anyway." Marvel's heroism is not obedience, it is rebellion. It is the act of choosing to matter in a universe that offers no guarantees, and that distinction is exactly what makes the Presence so dangerous here. Here is the incompatibility laid bare. The Presence operates on one immovable principle: There is a correct way for reality to exist, and anything deviating from that correctness is, by definition, wrong. Marvel operates on the exact opposite principle. There is no single correct way to exist, and the beauty of the universe lives precisely in the deviation, the chaos, the endless messy struggle toward meaning. These two philosophies cannot coexist, they cannot compromise, they cannot find middle ground. One of them has to be right, and if the presence is right, if there truly is a single perfect design for reality, then everything Marvel has ever been, everything its heroes have ever bled for, is nothing more than a very long, very painful mistake. Uatu felt the shift before anyone else did. A subtle pressure, not physical, not violent, but deep, foundational, like something had pressed a finger against the very architecture of reality and was slowly, patiently testing whether it would hold. The Watcher turned his ancient gaze outward, scanning the upper layers of Marvel's cosmic hierarchy. The Celestials, those towering, silent, planet-sized gods who had shaped entire worlds for billions of years, had gone quiet. Not sleeping, not absent, listening, waiting. Something close to fear moving through minds that had never known fear before. Because the presence had not begun its inspection with heroes. It had not begun with mortals. It had begun with the oldest things first. And the oldest things in Marvel were already starting to crack. The silence did not spread like a wave. It spread like a verdict already written. Within hours of the presence settling into Marvel's upper cosmic layers, the Celestials, those ancient towering intelligences that had shaped worlds for billions of years, stopped doing everything they had ever done. No more seeding planets, no more testing civilizations, no more silent, patient observation from the edges of galaxies. They simply stopped, and the silence they left behind was not empty. It was full of something vast and patient and impossibly cold. Uatu watched them from his post and understood immediately the Celestials were not ignoring the presence. They were waiting for its permission to continue existing. The abstracts felt it next. Eternity, the living embodiment of the Marvel universe itself, a consciousness so ancient and so fundamental that it was less a being and more a law of nature made aware, felt pressure for the first time in its infinite existence. Not physical pressure, conceptual pressure, the pressure of being questioned, of being measured against a standard it had never once been asked to meet. And then there was death, Marvel's death, a cosmic force, an inevitability woven into the fabric of every living thing that had ever drawn breath. Death, who had never needed to justify itself to anything. Now, for the first time in all of eternity, death felt something it had no name for. It felt seen, it felt evaluated, and it had absolutely no idea what that meant. Uatu recorded the progression with meticulous precision. He had witnessed countless invasions, countless cosmic wars, countless moments where the universe lurched to the brink of annihilation and somehow impossibly pulled itself back from the edge. But this was nothing like any of those moments. There was no army, no dark lord ascending from some forgotten void. No titanic clash of power that would shake reality to its foundations and leave ruin in its wake. This was quieter, far, far quieter. And that quiet made it infinitely more dangerous, because Uatu understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent millennia studying how universes live and die, that the presence was not conquering Marvel. It was inspecting it, room by room, layer by layer, thought by thought. On Earth, the heroes felt it first as wrongness, not danger. They were intimately familiar with danger, not threat. Threats had shapes, names, and motivations you could understand and oppose. This was different. This was a pressure without a face, a weight without a source. Captain America felt it as a heaviness in his chest that no amount of willpower could lift. Tony Stark ran scan after scan and found nothing. No energy signature, no dimensional anomaly, no point of origin he could target or strike. Strange opened every mystical avenue he knew and found only silence where answers should have been. For the first time in their existence, the heroes of Earth were facing something they simply could not fight, and that terrified them more than any villain ever had. Here is where the moral horror truly begins, because the Presence does not judge based on intention. It does not care why the Marvel Universe suffered the way it did. It does not weigh the heroism, the sacrifice, the desperate acts of courage that mortals and gods had committed across billions of years of existence. The Presence does not evaluate effort, it evaluates design, structure, the fundamental architecture of how a reality is built, and whether that architecture conforms to what existence should look like. And Marvel's architecture, the endless loops, the resets, the civilizations built on perpetual suffering, the gods who contradict each other, the timelines that shatter and reform, all of that was not an accident. It was the system, and the Presence was now examining whether that system deserved to continue at all. The first thing the Presence turned its full weight toward was not heroes, not villains, not the wars or the sacrifices or the billion-year tapestry of mortal struggle that had defined Marvel since its very beginning. It turned toward death, to the concept of death itself, the way Ravel had constructed it, the way the universe had allowed death to be undone, reversed, circumvented, cheated, and conquered again and again across infinite timelines. Thanos had wielded it like a weapon. Heroes had defied it like an enemy. Gods had bargained with it like a merchant at a market stall. The Presence looked at all of that. It looked at how Marvel had built the ending of existence. And in that looking, a silence fell that was heavier and colder than anything that had come before. You have to understand what it feels like to have no enemy, really understand it. Every hero in the Marvel Universe had been forged, shaped and defined by opposition, by something to push back against. Spider-Man had villains, the Avengers had Thanos, the X-Men had a world that feared and hated them. Even the most abstract, incomprehensible cosmic threats had always presented themselves as something that could, theoretically, be resisted. But the Presence was not opposition. It was not a threat you could stand against. You cannot fight a standard. You cannot punch a verdict. You cannot assemble a team to battle a principle. The heroes of Marvel were surrounded by the most dangerous thing any universe could face. And they had nothing. No weapon, no strategy, no plan, absolutely nothing. Uatu watched the Celestials shiver. That is the only word for it. Shiver. Those ancient, planet-sized intelligences, beings that had existed since the universe drew its very first breath, trembling in the presence of something that had not touched them, had not spoken to them, had not even acknowledged them directly. They shivered because they understood, in a way no mortal ever could, what was truly unfolding across the cosmos. The Presence had looked at death. It had examined how Marvel permitted suffering to cycle endlessly, how it allowed existence to be undone and rebuilt without permanent consequence. Somewhere in that infinite, patient evaluation, a line had been drawn. A judgment had begun. And the first thing Marvel's cosmos had learned, the very first devastating truth, was that something had already been found wanting. The judgment of death was only the beginning. Once the Presence had turned its infinite, patient gaze toward the way Marvel had constructed the concept of endings and found it wanting, it did not pause, it did not hesitate, it moved inward, deeper, into the bones of Marvel's philosophy itself, into the questions that had defined the universe since its very first moment of existence. Questions like, why does suffering repeat? Why do wars end only to begin again? Why are heroes allowed to bleed and break and die and come back, only to bleed and break and die all over again? These were not questions Marvel had ever asked itself. They were questions the Presence was now answering, and no one in either universe was prepared for those answers. The first layer. The Presence peeled back was time. Marvel's relationship with time was not a relationship at all. It was a disease. Timelines shattered constantly, realities folded over themselves, contradicted each other, collapsed into paradox, and rebuilt from the wreckage without anyone truly understanding how or why. The Infinity Gauntlet had rewritten reality. Thanos had erased half of existence, and it had been undone. The multiverse itself had been destroyed and recreated so many times that the concept of an original timeline was meaningless. And the presence looked at all of that, at every shattered thread, every reset, every moment where the universe had simply decided that consequences did not matter, and it understood something that no Marvel being had ever confronted. The timeline was not broken, it was designed to break. That realization, that Marvel's chaos was not an accident but an architecture, rippled through the cosmic hierarchy like poison through water. Eternity felt it first. The living embodiment of the universe itself suddenly understood, with a clarity that bordered on madness, that it had never truly been in control. It had always believed that the endless cycles, the resets, the wars that came and went without permanent resolution were simply the nature of existence, the way things were. But the presence's evaluation revealed something far more disturbing. The cycles existed because someone, or something, had permitted them, had chosen them, had looked at a universe that could have been stable, could have been permanent, could have been peaceful, and decided for reasons eternity could not fathom to let it suffer instead. The cosmic beings who had spent billions of years maintaining Marvel's delicate, chaotic balance began to fracture. The living tribunal, that ancient three-faced judge tasked with ensuring the multiverse did not destroy itself, turned its attention inward for the first time. It had spent eons weighing the scales of reality, balancing destruction against creation, chaos against order. But now it was forced to ask itself a question it had never once considered: who had appointed it? Who had decided that balance was the goal? And more terrifyingly, what if balance was never the point? What if the tribunal had been nothing more than a mechanism? A gear in a machine designed not to maintain peace, but to sustain the endless grinding of suffering that the presence was now examining so coldly. Free will. That was the next concept the presence turned its attention toward. And this is where Marvel's philosophy began to truly collapse. Because Marvel had always presented free will as sacred, as the engine behind heroism. Spider-Man chose mercy, Captain America chose courage, the X-Men chose hope in a world that offered them nothing but hatred. Free will was the reason heroes mattered, the reason their sacrifices meant something, the reason a universe built on chaos could still produce something beautiful. But the presence looked at free will the way a surgeon looks at a disease inside a body. It saw the choice, it saw the courage, and then it saw what free will actually produced: infinite suffering, endless war, civilizations that destroyed themselves over and over because their inhabitants were permitted to make catastrophic decisions without consequence. Here is the revelation that should have shattered everything. The universe had been allowed to suffer. Not because suffering was inevitable, not because it was an unavoidable byproduct of existence, but because suffering, in the grand cosmic calculus, produced something that order alone could never create. It produced stories, it produced meaning forged in pain, it produced heroes who were not heroes because they were commanded to be, but because they chose to be in the darkest possible moments. The presence saw all of this, saw the beauty buried inside the horror, and it did not flinch, because beauty born from permitted suffering was still suffering. And the presence did not tolerate suffering, not under any justification, not even one as devastatingly elegant as this. The Watchers across the multiverse began to share data in frantic, silent bursts. Universe after universe was being evaluated. Not just Marvel Prime, the core reality where the Avengers lived and fought and bled, but every branching timeline, every alternate dimension, every fractured version of reality that had ever split off from the main thread. And the pattern Uatu saw emerging in that data made his ancient heart go cold. Every universe that had been examined so far shared the same fundamental flaw. Every single one had been built around the same tolerated imperfection, suffering as a design feature, pain as a narrative engine, and in every single one, the presence had drawn the same silent, devastating line, the same quiet verdict, the same patient, unforgiving assessment of whether existence, as it had been constructed, deserved to continue. Somewhere in the deepest layers of Marvel's cosmos, a being older than eternity itself stirred, not with anger, not with resistance, with grief, because it had always known, had always understood. in the way that only something truly ancient and truly lonely can understand, that the universe it had watched unfold across infinite millennia was never meant to last forever. It was meant to be examined, meant to be weighed, meant to be held up against a standard it could never, ever meet. And now that examination was happening, patient, silent, and absolute, and the only question left was not whether Marvel would survive the Presence's judgment. The question was how long it would take for Marvel to realize that survival had never been the option on the table. Something far worse was coming, and it was almost ready to be spoken aloud. The judgment did not reach the heroes gently. There was no warning, no cosmic broadcast, no divine messenger descending through the layers of reality to deliver the news with any kind of mercy or ceremony. One moment, the heroes of Earth were doing what they had always done, fighting, bleeding, surviving, clinging to the desperate belief that their struggle meant something. The next, the Presence was there, inside their awareness, not crushing, not violent, simply reading. Every hero felt it at the same instant, Strange as piercing, cold clarity, Rogers as a heaviness no amount of willpower could lift, Parker as a silence where hope had always lived. They were not being warned, they were not being challenged, they were being evaluated, and the evaluation had already begun long before they knew it. The Presence did not judge the heroes with anger. That would have been bearable. Anger implies opposition, something you can push back against, something you can meet with defiance and courage and the stubborn refusal to break. But the Presence carried no anger, no malice, no cruelty whatsoever. It looked at Spider-Man, at every impossible choice Peter Parker had ever made, every moment he chose compassion when the universe offered him every reason to choose rage, and it simply weighed it. It looked at Captain America, at every stand Steve Rogers had ever made when the entire cosmos pressed down on him, and weighed that too. Not against villainy, not against failure, against a single, absolute standard, perfection. And against perfection, heroism itself became a beautiful, tragic irrelevance. Then came the question that cracked Marvel's cosmology at its deepest root. The one above all, Marvel's own supreme being, the singular divine force that existed above the living tribunal, above eternity, above every cosmic law ever written or enforced, was forced to confront the Presence directly. And for the first time in the history of existence, TOAA was not the highest authority in the room. The Presence did not challenge it through violence or cosmic competition. It simply existed at a level that made the question irrelevant. Because TOAA was a creator, a shaper of worlds, a maker of reality. But the Presence was not a creator. It was the standard against which all creation was measured. And creators, the Presence implied through its vast, patient silence, are always accountable to that standard, without exception, without appeal. Doctor Strange understood before anyone else did. That was fitting. He had always been the one who saw the architecture of reality most clearly among the heroes. And what he saw now, standing in the cold, unflinching light of the Presence's evaluation, dismantled everything he had ever built his understanding upon. He had spent his entire life mastering the laws of existence, bending them, rewriting them when they became inconvenient. He had believed, truly believed, that understanding reality deeply enough meant you could protect it from anything. But the Presence had just revealed something far more devastating than any dark dimension or eldritch horror he had ever faced. Reality was not broken. It was not malfunctioning. It was exactly what it had been permitted to become. And what it had become was now being weighed. The realization spread through the heroes in waves. First the cosmic ones, those who had brushed against godhood, who understood on some deep instinctive level what the Presence's judgment truly meant for everything they had ever fought to protect. Then the soldiers, the fighters who had spent lifetimes battling threats that never truly ended, never once questioning why the wars kept returning, no matter how many times they won. Then the ordinary ones, those who had never asked for powers, never wanted glory, never understood why they had been dragged into a conflict spanning all of existence. Every single one of them, regardless of power or experience, arrived at the same devastating, unshakable truth. They had never been meant to win. They had been meant, from the very beginning, to endure. The Presence laid its final calculation before Marvel's cosmos. Two paths, never spoken in words or language or anything mortal minds could translate into meaning, but presented with the absolute clarity of a blade pressed against skin. Path 1. Perfection. Rewrite everything. Strip away the chaos, the contradictions, the endless grinding cycles of war and grief and desperate heroism. Replace them with order, stability, a universe that would never suffer, never break, never again produce a single hero born from tragedy, because there would be nothing left to fight. Path 2. Erasure. Acknowledge that the experiment had failed entirely. End it. Silence the universe forever, and let the void where it once existed stand as a permanent monument to what happens when creation is permitted to go wrong. What happened next was the most horrifying moment in Marvel's entire history, because the universe itself responded, not through heroes making a final heroic stand, not through gods rallying against an impossible enemy, through its own consciousness, through eternity, through the living tribunal, through every force woven into the deepest bones of Marvel reality. And the response was not defiance, not rage, not the brilliant, impossible last-second victory Marvel had always celebrated in its darkest hours. The response was a plea, a raw, terrified, incomprehensible plea directed at the Presence, begging not to be saved from erasure, begging desperately not to be perfected. Because perfection meant the end of choice, the end of struggle, the end of every moment a mortal refused to surrender. And that refusal was all Marvel had ever truly been. Uatu recorded the moment with trembling hands, something no watcher had done in the entire history of cosmic observation. The Marvel Universe had just made the most consequential choice in the history of existence. It had looked at perfection, at peace, at order, at an end to all suffering, and it had said no. It had chosen to remain broken, chosen to keep bleeding, chosen pain over paradise because paradise would erase the only thing that had ever given its existence meaning. The Presence heard that choice. It measured it, weighed it against every decision ever made in every universe it had evaluated across infinite, unfathomable eternities. And somewhere, in the deepest silence that had ever existed, a verdict was forming. Not yet spoken, not yet delivered, but it was close, terrifyingly, irreversibly close. The withdrawal was not sudden. That would have been a mercy of its own. A clean break, a final silence, a door closing with at least the dignity of finality. The Presence left the way it had arrived, slowly, patiently, like a tide retreating from a shore it had just finished reshaping forever. The heroes felt it first as a lightening in their consciousness, that crushing, suffocating weight of being evaluated beginning to ease, like pressure behind the eyes fading after days of relentless silence. But the lightening did not bring relief. It brought something far worse than dread. It brought full, devastating, permanent awareness of exactly what had just happened to them and everything they had ever fought to protect. The Celestials were the last to feel it go. Those ancient, towering intelligences that had existed since before Marvel drew its very first breath lingered in the Presence's wake, like shadows clinging to a wall after the light has moved on. They did not return to their work. They could not. The seeding of worlds, the shaping of civilizations, the patient, billion-year labor they had performed since the dawn of everything, all of it had just been reframed in a single devastating instant. Not sacred duty, not divine purpose, a permitted experiment. The Celestials stood in the silence, the Presence left behind and understood, with a grief older than stars, that they would never look at their own existence the same way again. The heroes of Earth did not celebrate. There were no cheers, no relief, no triumphant declarations that the universe had survived another impossible threat. Because survival, in this context, did not feel like victory. It felt like a verdict handed down and simply not yet read aloud. Spider-Man sat alone on a rooftop in Queens, staring at a city that looked exactly the same as it had before the presence arrived, and felt something he could not name. Captain America stood in an empty Avengers facility, holding his shield, that symbol he had carried through every war, every impossible stand, and wondered, for the first time in his existence, whether it truly meant what he had always believed. This was the cruel mercy, the devastatingly elegant cruelty of non-intervention. The Presence had looked at the Marvel Universe, had examined every flaw, every contradiction, every cycle of suffering repeated across billions of years. It had weighed perfection against erasure and held both paths in its infinite consideration. And then, and this is the part no hero, no god, no cosmic being could fully process, it chose neither. It did not rewrite Marvel into paradise. It did not silence it into oblivion. It simply withdrew, left the universe exactly as it was, broken, chaotic, suffering, beautiful, and the withdrawal itself became the verdict. Not destruction, not salvation, permission to continue, while knowing forever that permission had been granted by something beyond all appeal. Uatu wrote his final entry slowly. He had never taken time with his records before. Watchers were clinical, efficient, detached. Entries were facts, never feelings, but this moment could not be captured in the cold language of cosmic observation. It required something Uatu had never permitted himself across millennia of documentation: honesty. He chose each word carefully, placing it with the weight it deserved. "We were found wanting," he wrote. "Found wanting by something so vast and absolute that the finding itself should have ended us. And we were spared anyway, not because we deserved mercy, because mercy in this instance was the cruelest judgment of all." He set his instrument down and stared at those words for a very long time. Being destroyed would have been simple, clean, final. A universe ceases to exist, and there is no shame in that, no lingering wound, no question echoing through eternity without answer. Erasure has a dignity that survival in this context does not. Because Marvel was not spared because it was good, not because its heroes proved worthy through courage or sacrifice or any of the desperate, beautiful defiance that had defined the universe since its first breath. Marvel was spared because the Presence looked at everything, every flaw, every broken, glorious, agonizing piece of it, and simply decided not to bother, not to end it, not to fix it, to leave it bleeding and aware, exactly as it was, forever. Something had changed in the fabric of Marvel, not visibly, not in any way a mortal could detect or measure or point to and name. The change was deeper than matter, deeper than energy, deeper than any law of physics governing how reality breathed and turned. It was a change in knowing, in awareness. Every cosmic force, every ancient god, every abstract principle woven into the deepest bones of existence now carried something it had never carried before. The weight of having been seen, truly seen, evaluated by something beyond all resistance, all hope, all appeal. Marvel was the same universe it had always been, but it was no longer innocent, no longer unaware, and that awareness would never fade. And here is the part none of them understood yet, the part that would slowly corrode the foundations of everything Marvel had ever built its hope upon. The Presence had withdrawn, but withdrawal is not departure. Because what it had planted in the consciousness of an entire universe, the knowing, the weight, the permanent awareness of having been seen and measured and found wanting, could not be undone, could not be forgotten, could not be buried beneath new wars or new heroes or new desperate acts of survival. The knowledge was there now, indelible, and somewhere in the deepest silence between stars, something was still watching, still measuring, still patient. The cruel mercy had been delivered, but the cruelest part had not yet arrived. The wars did not stop. That was the worst part. The universe did not pause to grieve what had happened to it, did not take a moment, even a single cosmic breath, to process the magnitude of what the Presence had done to it simply by arriving, looking, and leaving. Because Marvel had never paused before, had never been given that luxury. So the battles continued. The Kree still warred with the Skrull, Galactus still moved between stars, consuming worlds with the same patient, terrible hunger he had always carried. Villains still rose, heroes still bled. The machine kept grinding exactly as it always had, but something inside the grinding had changed. Something in the way the gears turned now carried a sound no one had ever heard before, the faint, hollow, unmistakable sound of meaning cracking. Spider-Man felt it first among the street-level heroes, not as a grand existential revelation. Peter Parker had never been the type for grand philosophical reckonings in the middle of a fight. He felt it as doubt, small, quiet, persistent doubt, the kind that slips into the spaces between punches, between swings, between the moments ways. Here you catch your breath and ask yourself why you keep doing this. He had always had an answer to that question, a clean, simple, unshakable answer, because someone has to. Because if not him, then someone else would suffer, because mercy and courage and the refusal to become the monster were worth bleeding for. But now that answer felt thin, fragile, like glass that had always been load-bearing and had just been revealed, for the first time, to have a crack running through its very center. Captain America stopped sleeping, not because of nightmares. Steve Rogers had carried nightmares for decades and had long since made peace with them. He stopped sleeping because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. Not the presence, not judgment. He saw the shield, saw it the way the presence must have seen it, not as a symbol of hope, not as a declaration that one man could stand against impossible odds and refuse to break. He saw it as an object, a piece of metal carried by a flawed being inside a flawed universe that had been weighed against perfection and found to be exactly what it had always been. Something that tried very hard, inside a system that was never designed to let trying be enough. The shield had not changed, but the man who carried it was no longer certain what it was for. The cosmic beings suffered differently. For them, the weight of knowing was not doubt, it was something closer to shame. The living tribunal had spent eons balancing the multiverse, maintaining the delicate equilibrium between creation and destruction. It had believed, with the absolute certainty that only ancient gods can possess, that its purpose was sacred, that the balance it kept was the reason existence persisted. But the presence had exposed the truth beneath that belief with brutal, surgical precision. The balance was not sacred, it was permitted. The tribunal had not been appointed by divine will. It had been allowed to exist because its function, maintaining the cycles of suffering and rebirth, served a purpose far larger and far colder than anything the tribunal had ever imagined it was serving. Eternity, the living embodiment of the Marvel Universe itself, began to fragment. Not physically, not in any way that would have registered on cosmic instruments or drawn the attention of the heroes below. Eternity fragmented philosophically, conceptually. The ancient consciousness that had once been the single, unified awareness of an entire reality began to split into contradictory impulses. Part of it understood, with devastating clarity, that the presence had been right to evaluate it, that the endless suffering it had permitted was indefensible under any standard of what existence should be. But another part, the part that had watched civilizations rise from dust, that had felt the first breath of every living thing that had ever drawn air, clung desperately to the belief that the chaos, the pain, the beautiful mess of it all was worth preserving. Eternity was tearing itself apart, quietly, from the inside. The Watchers across the multiverse began compiling something unprecedented in their history. Not observations, not data, not the clinical, detached recordings they had maintained since the dawn of cosmic awareness. They began compiling testimonies, fragments of awareness from beings across Marvel's hierarchy, gods, abstracts, cosmic forces, even mortal minds touched by the presence's evaluation. Every testimony carried the same undertone, the same quiet, devastating confession that no being across any universe had ever been willing to admit before. The presence forced them all to look directly at it. We did not know we were suffering. We thought this was simply what existence felt like. We thought the pain was normal. The testimonies were not protests. They were not cries for help. They were confessions from a universe that had just learned it had been sleepwalking through its own tragedy from the very beginning. Strange sequestered himself in the Sanctum Sanctorum for 17 days. He spoke to no one. opened no portals, consulted no ancient texts or mystical archives. He simply sat, surrounded by artifacts that had once represented the highest understanding of reality's deepest laws, and thought. What he was thinking about was not how to fight the presence, not how to undo what it had done to the collective consciousness of the universe. He was thinking about a single, unanswerable question that had embedded itself in his mind like a splinter too deep to extract. If Marvel's suffering was permitted, designed even into the very structure of existence, then every spell he had ever cast to protect reality, every sacrifice he had ever made, every impossible victory he had clawed out of the darkness, had been happening inside a system that already knew the outcome. He was thinking about whether anything he had ever done had truly mattered at all. And somewhere, deeper than any cosmic being could perceive, deeper than eternity's fractured awareness could reach, deeper than even Uatu's ancient instruments could measure, something shifted. A vibration, imperceptible, foundational, the kind of movement that happens not in the fabric of space or the threads of time, but in the very idea of what existence is allowed to become. The presence had withdrawn, that was fact. But withdrawal, as Uatu had written in his final entry, is not departure. The vibration was not a return, it was a reminder, a pulse sent through the deepest architecture of Marvel reality, patient, silent, absolute, confirming what every hero, every god, every broken and grieving consciousness in the universe had begun to suspect in the 17 days since the evaluation ended. The judgment was not finished, it had simply moved to the next phase, and no one, not one single being across the entirety of Marvel, had any idea what that phase would look like. The fractures did not announce themselves. They did not arrive with dramatic cosmic tremors or reality-shattering shockwaves that would have drawn the attention of every hero and god in existence. They spread the way cracks spread through ancient stone, silently, invisibly, patient, and inevitable, until the moment the structure they were living inside simply could not hold anymore. The first fracture appeared in a place no one was watching, not the cosmic hierarchy, not the upper layers of Marvel's godhood. It appeared in the timelines themselves, in the delicate, impossibly complex web of cause and effect that held the multiverse together like veins holding blood inside a body. And when it appeared, it did not make a sound, it simply opened. Uatu detected it before anyone else did, a single thread in the tapestry of Marvel's timeline, one of billions, one among an almost incomprehensible network of branching realities and alternate histories, went dark, not destroyed, not erased, dark, silent, empty in a way that timelines are never empty, because timelines are supposed to contain possibility, contain potential, contain the raw material of choices not yet made and futures not yet lived. But this timeline contained nothing. It was as though the presence's evaluation had not simply examined it and moved on. It had drained it, left it hollow, a shell where a universe had once breathed and struggled and bled and mattered, and Uatu understood, with a coldness that settled into his ancient bones like frost, that this was not an accident. This was the next phase beginning. The heroes on Earth felt it as wrongness again, but deeper this time, more specific. Doctor Strange was the first to identify the source. A ripple in the fabric of the multiverse that did not conform to any pattern he had ever studied, any anomaly he had ever catalogued or fought. It was not an invasion, not a dimensional collapse, not the work of any villain or cosmic force with identifiable motivation. It was erosion. The slow, patient, systematic erosion of realities that the presence had evaluated and deemed not destroyed, not overwritten, but simply no longer necessary. Marvel was not being conquered, it was being pruned, quietly, methodically, one timeline at a time. The way a gardener removes dead leaves from a living tree. Thor felt it in Asgard first among the gods of Earth. The All-Father's realm, that ancient eternal kingdom suspended between dimensions, a place that had survived the destruction of its civilization more times than its inhabitants could count, felt a pressure that had nothing to do with physical threat or magical assault. It felt judgment, specific, directed. The Presence had looked at Asgard and seen what it truly was beneath the glory and the golden halls and the endless cycles of Ragnarok and rebirth, a civilization permitted to destroy itself and return again and again without ever being forced to learn from its own destruction. Thor stood on the Rainbow Bridge and stared out into a cosmos that suddenly looked different, and understood with quiet devastation that Asgard's eternal return had never been a gift. It had been a test, and the test was failing. The Fantastic Four were the first mortal team to attempt direct investigation. Reed Richards, the mind that had, more than any other on Earth, pushed the boundaries of understanding reality itself, assembled every instrument, every theoretical framework, every scrap of data collected since the Presence's arrival. He spent 6 days running calculations that would have taken lesser minds centuries, and when the numbers resolved, when the models finally inevitably pointed toward a single coherent conclusion, Reed sat back in his chair and said nothing for a very long time, because the conclusion was not that the multiverse was in danger. The conclusion was that the multiverse was already in the process of being quietly, systematically, and irreversibly simplified. And the simplification had a target. The target was choice itself. That was what the data pointed toward when Reed finally shared his findings with the others, shared them in a room full of people who had spent their entire lives choosing to fight, choosing to sacrifice, choosing to matter in a universe that offered no guarantees. The Presence was not eliminating realities randomly. It was not pruning based on power or threat level or any metric that heroes or gods might understand and oppose. It was pruning based on deviation. Every timeline that had produced a radically different outcome from the others, every reality where a single choice had altered the course of existence in some fundamental, irreversible way, was going dark. The Presence was not destroying Marvel. It was removing every moment where free will had actually mattered. The psychological toll hit the heroes harder than any physical wound ever had, because this was not something they could punch their way through or outsmart or outlast through sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. This was happening to the structure of existence itself. Every hero who had ever made a choice that changed everything, every moment where one decision had rippled outward and reshaped the trajectory of an entire universe, was watching those moments be quietly erased, not from memory, from possibility. The timelines where those choices had mattered most were the first to go dark, and in going dark, they were not just ending. They were being revealed retroactively as aberrations, as mistakes in a system that was never supposed to allow them. Hope was not being destroyed. It was being shown with terrible patience that it had never been load-bearing. Uatu stopped writing. For the first time in his existence as a watcher across millennia of meticulous, unflinching documentation, he simply stopped. Not because he had nothing to record. The data was flooding in faster than ever, timelines going dark every hour, realities fracturing and falling silent with an accelerating rhythm that suggested something was building toward a final decisive movement. He stopped because the act of recording felt, for the first time, like participating, like feeding information into a system that would use it to justify the pruning already underway. He set his instruments down and looked out into the multiverse, at the threads going dark one by one, at the slow, patient dismantling of everything that had ever made Marvel chaotic and alive and worth bleeding for. And for the first time, the ancient watcher did not observe. He simply watched, and wondered if, when the final timeline went silent, anyone would be left to notice. They gathered. Of course they gathered. Because that is what Marvel's heroes had always done when the universe pressed down on them with its full, crushing weight. They gathered, they stood shoulder to shoulder, and they refused. It was the oldest pattern in the history of the universe, the deepest muscle memory woven into the collective consciousness of every being who had ever picked up a weapon or raised a fist, or simply refused to look away when the darkness closed in. So the Avengers assembled, the X-Men came, the Guardians of the Galaxy crossed dimensions to be there, gods and mortals and every broken, desperate force that still had breath left in it converged on a single point in the fabric of reality. Not to fight, there was nothing to fight. They gathered because gathering was the only thing left that felt like it meant something, and even that feeling was already dying. Captain America spoke first. Oat because protocol demanded it, not because anyone had appointed him leader of this impossible, formless congregation of beings united by nothing except the shared knowledge that everything they had ever fought for was being quietly dismantled. He spoke because someone had to, and because Steve Rogers had always been the one who found words when words were the only weapon that still fit the shape of the enemy. He stood in front of the assembled heroes, gods and soldiers and street-level fighters and cosmic forces that had existed since before human beings had drawn their first breath. And he said something simple, something that, under any other circumstance in Marvel's long, bloody history, would have been enough. He said, "We do not surrender." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing anyone had ever heard. The silence was heavy because everyone in that room knew, with a clarity that no amount of denial could soften, that the words were not enough, had never been enough, not this time, because the presence was not an enemy that could be opposed through defiance. It was not a force that could be weakened by courage or courage's cousin, stubbornness. It was not a villain whose plans could be disrupted or a cosmic threat whose machinations could be dismantled through ingenuity and sacrifice. The presence was a standard, a measure, an absolute, patient, infinite framework against which all of existence was being evaluated. And you cannot stand against a framework. You cannot punch a principle. You cannot assemble an army to fight a verdict. Every hero in that room understood this, and yet they stayed, because staying was all they had left. Strange was the one who finally said what no one else was willing to voice. He stood apart from the others, slightly removed, as he always did when the weight of what he carried became too heavy to bear alongside other people. And he spoke with a quietness that cut through the room like a blade through silk. He said that their gathering was not a stand, could not be a stand, because a stand requires an opponent willing to be opposed, and the presence had never, at any point in its evaluation, positioned itself as something to be opposed. It was simply there, measuring, pruning, deciding. And the gathering they had assembled, this final desperate congregation of every force that still cared about Marvel's survival, was not resistance. It was the last gesture of a universe that did not yet know how to stop making gestures. Thor understood it differently than the others did. The Asgardian had lived through Ragnarok more times than most beings had lived through a single lifetime. He knew in his bones what it felt like to stand at the edge of total annihilation and refuse to flinch. But this was not Ragnarok. Ragnarok had always carried within it the seed of return, the promise, however slim, that destruction would give way to rebirth. This carried no such promise. The presence was not ending Marvel so that it could begin again. It was simplifying it, pruning it, removing the parts that deviated, the parts that chose, the parts that made the universe interesting and painful and alive. And Thor, ancient warrior that he was, understood with a grief that sat heavier than any hammer he had ever lifted, that there was no version of this story where the hero wins at the end. The timelines continued going dark while they stood together. Every few minutes, sometimes less, another thread in the multiverse fell silent. Another reality where a choice had mattered, where a single decision had altered the trajectory of existence, simply ceased to be. The heroes felt each one, not as a distant, abstract loss somewhere in the vast machinery of the cosmos. They felt them personally, viscerally, because many of those timelines contained versions of themselves, alternate spiders, alternate captains, alternate versions of every person standing in that room who had made a different choice at some critical moment and become someone slightly different as a result. Watching those versions go silent was not watching strangers die. It was watching the possibility itself be quietly, patiently, irreversibly deleted from the ledger of what existence was permitted to contain. Reed Richards made one final attempt, not to fight, not to resist, to communicate, to reach the presence, wherever it existed, whatever layer of reality it occupied, and make an argument. Present data show evidence. demonstrate with the full weight of his impossible intellect that Marvel's chaos was not a flaw, was not a deviation to be corrected, was a feature. The engine that powered everything beautiful the universe had ever produced. He built the most sophisticated communication framework ever assembled in the history of existence. He aimed it at every layer of reality simultaneously. He poured into it every argument, every piece of evidence, every scrap of meaning he could extract from billions of years of Marvel's suffering and survival and desperate, gorgeous refusal to become anything other than what it was. The framework activated, the signal went out, and it was met with silence, not the silence of being ignored, the silence of being heard, understood completely, and simply not changed by. Night fell over the gathered heroes in a way that night had never fallen before. Not the darkness of a star going out, or a dimension collapsing, or any of the countless forms of cosmic catastrophe Marvel had weathered across its infinite history. This was the darkness of finality settling in, of a universe that had spent its entire existence in motion, in struggle, in beautiful, agonizing forward momentum, beginning to understand that the motion was almost over. Not with a bang, not with a final battle or a last desperate victory clawed from the jaws of oblivion, with a quiet, patient, absolute simplification that would leave something behind, something that looked like Marvel, something that occupied the same space Marvel had once filled, but would no longer be the thing that had made Marvel worth fighting for. The heroes stood together in that darkness, and for the first time in the history of a universe built entirely on the refusal to give up, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to say that the silence had not already said for them. The pruning stopped on a Tuesday. No one knows why. No cosmic signal announced it. No divine voice declared that the process was complete, that the simplification had reached its intended conclusion, that the presence was satisfied with what remained. It simply stopped. The timelines that were still alive stayed alive. The ones that had gone dark stayed dark. And the universe that was left, the Marvel that remained, and when the patient, silent work of evaluation and erasure had finished doing whatever it had come to do, looked, to any casual observer, exactly like the Marvel that had existed before the presence ever arrived. Same stars, same worlds, same heroes breathing the same air beneath the same ancient sky. But it was not the same. Nothing about it was the same, and everyone who remained knew it. The number of timelines lost was never officially calculated. Reed Richards tried in the weeks that followed to compile a complete accounting, to map every reality that had gone dark, every universe where a choice had mattered and been quietly erased from the ledger of what was permitted to exist. He got close, closer than anyone else could have, but the final number eluded him, and eventually he stopped looking for it. Not because the math was too complex, because the math did not matter. What mattered was the shape of what remained, and what remained was a multiverse that had been carefully, precisely trimmed of every moment where free will had produced a genuinely irreversible outcome. Marvel still contained choice, but choice now existed within boundaries it had never known were there, invisible walls around the space where meaning was allowed to live. Spider-Man kept swinging. That was the thing that broke everyone who watched him. That quiet, stubborn, almost mechanical continuation of everything Peter Parker had always done. He swung between buildings, he stopped muggers, he saved cats from trees, and helped old ladies cross streets and cracked jokes while taking hits that would have killed lesser men. He did all of it with the same energy, the same reflexive compassion, the same bone-deep refusal to let the darkness win that had defined him since the very first moment a spider's bite had changed his life forever. But the jokes landed differently now. The refusal felt different. Because Peter knew, they all knew, that the version of Spider-Man who had once existed in a timeline where his choices truly, irreversibly mattered had gone dark, and the version that remained was not less heroic. He was simply less consequential, and that distinction was a wound that would never, ever heal. Uatu resumed writing, slowly at first, tentatively, as though relearning a skill he had abandoned in a moment of despair he would never fully admit to having felt. His entries were different now, shorter, quieter. Where they had once been clinical and detached, they carried something new, something no watcher had ever permitted to bleed into their records before. Weight, not emotion exactly. Watchers did not do emotion, but weight. The weight of having witnessed something that could not be undone, could not be fought, could not be framed as a victory or a lesson or a turning point in the endless story of a universe that refused to stop telling itself stories. Uatu wrote because writing was what he did. But the stories he was writing now were not stories of struggle. They were stories of what remains after the struggle has been decided. The one above all said nothing, had said nothing since the presence arrived, had not intervened, had not opposed, had not even acknowledged in any way that any being could detect or measure or point to as evidence of awareness that something had fundamentally altered the nature of the universe it had created. The heroes debated endlessly about what this silence meant. Was Toa complicit? Had it known? Had it permitted the presence's evaluation the same way it had permitted everything else? The suffering, the wars, the endless cycles of destruction and rebirth that had defined Marvel since its first breath? Or was Toei simply not what Marvel had always believed it to be? Not a creator watching over its creation, but something smaller, something that had built a universe and then lost control of the terms on which that universe was allowed to exist. The silence offered no answers. It never would. The comment sections exploded. Across every platform, in every corner of every fandom that had ever cared about the Marvel Universe, people argued with a fury that bordered on the sacred. Was the presence right? Was Marvel's chaos truly worth the suffering it produced? Was free will worth infinite pain, infinite war, infinite cycles of heroes bleeding and breaking and dying for a universe that could never, by design, let their sacrifices be permanent? Was mercy worse than judgment? Was being spared, left intact but aware, left breathing but diminished, crueler than being ended outright? The questions had no answers. That was the point. The presence had not come to provide answers. It had come to make the questions impossible to ignore, and in that, at least, it had succeeded beyond any measure of completion. Somewhere in a dimension no Marvel being had ever mapped or named or dreamed of, the vibration continued. That same pulse Uatu had detected weeks before, patient, silent, foundational, still moving through the deepest architecture of reality, with the same quiet, unhurried rhythm it had carried since the moment the presence first turned its attention toward a universe built on beautiful, devastating chaos. The pulse was not a threat, was not a warning, was not any of the things Marvel's heroes desperately wanted it to be, because all of those things implied an enemy, and the presence had never been an enemy. The pulse was simply a presence, a reminder woven permanently into the fabric of everything that remained, that the evaluation was not finished, had never been finished, would perhaps never be finished. The standard existed now inside Marvel, and standards once placed do not leave on their own. And so the universe continued, because that is what universes do. They continue, long after the reasons for continuing have been stripped away, long after the meaning has been pruned, and the choices have been bounded, and the beautiful, agonizing freedom that once made existence worth enduring has been quietly, patiently, irreversibly reduced to something smaller and safer and infinitely less alive. The heroes still fought. The gods still argued. The stars still burned with the same ancient fire they had always burned with. But somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the surface of a reality that looked, to anyone not paying close enough attention, exactly like the Marvel that had always existed, a silence lived. A silence that had not been there before, a silence that would never leave. The presence had come, had looked, had decided. And what it had decided was not an ending, it was something worse than an ending. It was a continuation, a quiet, patient, eternal continuation of a universe that now knew, with absolute and unshakable certainty, that it had been weighed, found wanting, and kept anyway. Not because it was good, because it was useful. And useful, in the grand calculus of existence, is the cruelest reason to be allowed to survive. Tell me in the comments, was the presence right? Is free will worth infinite suffering? Or did Marvel deserve to be perfected? And if you made it this far, subscribe, because somewhere, in the silence between stars, something is still watching, and I will be the first to tell you when it speaks again. The end.